The receipt was folded in half, tucked inside the inner zippered pocket of her yoga bag. The one she always kept hanging on the back of the bathroom door. The one I never touched because she'd told me once, early in our marriage, that her bag was her space. Her territory. I'd respected that for 11 years. I wasn't looking for anything the morning I found it. That's the part that still makes me pause when I think about it now. I wasn't a suspicious man. I wasn't the kind of husband who checked his wife's phone or interrogated her about her plans. I was the kind of man who made her coffee before she woke up and left it on the bathroom counter with a folded paper towel underneath so the mug wouldn't leave a ring. I was the kind of man who believed, genuinely and without irony, that we were happy. The bag had fallen off the hook in the night. She'd left that morning for her yoga retreat, a weekend thing she'd been doing every few months for the past 2 years, driving up to a wellness center in the mountains about 3 hours north of the city. She'd taken the bag with her, or so I'd assumed. When I came into the bathroom to shower, I saw it on the floor, spilled open at the seam where the zipper had given way. I almost left it there. I almost stepped over it, showered, and gone about my Saturday the way I always did when she was away. Slowly, quietly, with the specific peaceful loneliness of a man who has the house to himself for 48 hours. Instead, I picked it up. The receipt slipped out when I lifted the bag. It fluttered to the tile like a dead leaf, face down. I turned it over. The Meridian Hotel, not the wellness center, not anywhere near the mountains. The Meridian Hotel was in Cartwell, a city I knew well because I'd driven through it dozens of times on work trips, a city that sat in the opposite direction from the retreat center, a city separated from ours by a two-lane highway and a stretch of flat farmland that smelled of turned earth in spring. Check-in, Friday, October 11th. That was yesterday, the day she'd driven away with her overnight bag and her mat rolled under her arm, kissed me on the cheek, and said, "Don't forget to water the ficus." The room was booked under 2 names, hers and a man named Daniel Voss. I stood in my bathroom with the receipt in my hand for a very long time. The coffee maker was running in the kitchen, filling the apartment with the smell of dark roast. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a child was laughing. The world was completely, grotesquely ordinary. My name is Marcus Hale. I was 43 years old. I worked as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm that specialized in commercial renovation. Unglamorous work, detail-oriented, slow. My wife, Claire, was 41. She ran the communications department for a nonprofit organization that funded early childhood literacy programs. She was warm, articulate, organized to a fault. She brought homemade muffins to our neighbors when they were sick. She remembered everyone's birthdays. We had been married for 11 years. We had a daughter, Lily, who was 9 and currently at her grandmother's for the weekend. We had a mortgage. We had a shared calendar on our phones. We had dinner together almost every night. I set the receipt on the edge of the sink. I looked at it for another long moment. Then I got in the shower, and I stood under the water until it ran cold. The opening operates on a foundation of carefully constructed trust, and it is precisely that trust which makes the discovery so devastating. Marcus describes himself not through achievement or ambition, but through care. The coffee on the counter, the paper towel beneath the mug, 11 years of respecting the boundary of her bag. These are the behaviors of a man who has organized his emotional identity around being a steady, considerate partner. Psychologically, this reflects secure attachment, a belief that the relationship is governed by mutual respect and good faith. The receipt does not merely introduce the possibility of infidelity. It retroactively destabilizes the entire architecture of Marcus's self-understanding. He is not just discovering a potential betrayal. He is confronting the possibility that the context in which he built his sense of self may have been false all along. The detail that he was not looking for anything is critical. Suspicion would have been a form of preparation. This discovery, arriving in the most mundane possible moment, bypasses all psychological defense and hits without warning. The cold shower at the end is not dramatic. It is the body continuing through its motions while the mind tries, and fails, to process the irreversible. The wellness retreats had started 2 years ago, in the autumn after Claire was promoted to director. She'd come home one evening. I remembered the night clearly because I'd made pasta and left it warming in the oven, and announced that her therapist had recommended she find a restorative practice. Something just for herself. She was under pressure at work. The new role came with a board of directors who were slow to trust her, a staff who'd expected someone more senior, a fundraising cycle that had started badly. She looked tired in a way that was newer than her usual tired, thinner around the eyes, a tightness in the jaw she only got when she was genuinely worn down. I'd encouraged it. Of course I had. I'd looked up the Mountain Clarity Wellness Center myself and shown her the reviews. I'd helped her pack the first time, folding her things neatly into the overnight bag, tucking her noise-canceling headphones in the side pocket. I'd told her the house would be fine, that Lily and I would have a good weekend, that she deserved it. I had believed all of that. There was the phone, for instance. Claire had always been open with her phone. Early in our relationship, she'd had a habit of sliding it across the table face up when we talked, a kind of unconscious signal that she wasn't distracted, wasn't hiding. Sometime in the last year or two, that had changed. The phone stayed face down. She took it to the bathroom. She angled the screen away when she typed. I'd noticed it, and I had filed it under the broad category of privacy. She was a communications director. She dealt with sensitive organizational information. It had seemed reasonable. There was the new intensity around the retreats. Somewhere around the fourth or fifth one, she'd become protective of the schedule in a way that felt slightly different from before. She pre-booked them months in advance now, noted them in the shared calendar with a small green leaf icon, and deflected any suggestion that we might do something together that weekend with a firmness that was gentle but immovable. I'd suggested once, maybe 8 months ago, that Lily and I drive up and meet her for lunch on the Sunday. She'd said the center didn't allow outside visitors during the program. I'd accepted that without checking. There was, now that I turned it over, the name Daniel Voss. She'd mentioned him once. 18 months ago, maybe 2 years, he'd come up in the context of her work. A consultant the organization had brought in for a fundraising strategy review. She described him as brilliant and exhausting, the kind of man who talked over everyone in meetings, but occasionally said something so precisely correct that you had to forgive him. She'd rolled her eyes while describing him, and I'd laughed. He'd been a story she told. A character, not a person. After I got out of the shower, I typed his name into a search engine for the first time. Daniel Voss, 47. Founder of a consultancy specializing in nonprofit development strategy. Based in Cartwell. His professional photograph showed a man with a narrow face, close-cropped gray at the temples, the kind of practiced, direct smile that people in his field cultivated like a business tool. I stared at his face on my phone screen for a long time. I felt nothing I recognized. Not rage. Not grief. Something more like the sensation of stepping onto a surface that should be solid and finding that it gives slightly underfoot. That specific nauseating moment before you know whether you are going to fall. I went to the kitchen. I stood over the sink. I drank a glass of water. The ficus needed watering. I watered it. Here illustrates the psychological phenomenon of retroactive reinterpretation, the way a single revelation rewrites memory. Every detail Marcus recalls, the turned-down phone, the pre-booked retreats, the rejected lunch invitation, existed in his awareness before this morning. But inside the frame of a trusting marriage, each was given a generous interpretation. The phone was privacy. The scheduling was self-care. The closed-off weekends were necessary restoration. What makes betrayal so psychologically complex is not only what the deceived partner didn't see, but what they actively chose to contextualize charitably. Trust, at its core, is a cognitive act, a continuous decision to interpret ambiguous information in the most generous available direction. Marcus wasn't blind. He was trusting. The difference is significant. The detail of Daniel Voss having been introduced as a professional anecdote, someone Claire had framed as mildly annoying, almost comic, represents a classic concealment technique, whether conscious or not, neutralizing a threat by narrating it into insignificance before it can become suspect. The ficus, watered mechanically at the end, is Marcus's psyche doing what it must, finding the smallest possible task, the most controllable possible action, in a moment when everything larger has become unmanageable. I did not call her that day. This was a decision I made consciously, standing in the kitchen with my phone in my hand and her name on the screen. I put the phone face down on the counter, and I thought about what I knew and what I didn't know, and I tried to be precise about the difference. What I knew: a hotel receipt with her name and a man's name on it, for a room checked in the previous evening in a city that was not where she'd said she was going. What I didn't know: everything else. I had learned, years ago, From a situation at work involving a contractor accused of billing fraud that turned out to have an entirely innocent explanation, that the moment you confront someone with incomplete information, you lose the only advantage you have, the element of ignorance. Once accused, people become careful. Once careful, they become impenetrable. I had watched a project manager demand answers from a subcontractor in a conference room while the rest of us sat in embarrassed silence. And I had watched the subcontractor calmly, almost pityingly, dismantle every assumption with a folder of paperwork he brought for exactly that purpose. I was a structural engineer. I understood load bearing. I understood the difference between a wall that looks solid and a wall that is solid. Before you start knocking, you find out which one you're dealing with. So I spent Saturday doing what I always did when she was away. I ran in the morning. I worked on the backyard project that had been stalled since August. I drove to the hardware store for wood screws and a new drill bit. I did these things with a mechanical thoroughness that I recognized as a kind of psychological self-protection. As long as I was doing something with my hands, the receipt stayed in the part of my mind I had deliberately sealed off. It was there. It would be there when I was ready. On Saturday evening, I called my friend Owen, who was a family law attorney. Not to ask him anything, just to hear his voice. We talked about football for 20 minutes, and he complained about a client, and I laughed in the right places. When I hung up, I sat in the silence of the house and realized that the silence had a different quality than it usually did when Claire was away. Heavier, more watchful, as if the house itself knew something had changed. That night, I went to the shared calendar on my phone and scrolled back through every retreat entry Claire had marked over the past 2 years. 8 entries, 8 green leaf icons, each one a Friday through Sunday. I opened a notes app and wrote down the dates. Then I opened my bank's app and looked at the joint account. Claire managed most of the household finances. She was better at it than I was, more systematic, and I rarely checked this account in detail. I scrolled back through the transaction history with a new kind of attention. Most of it was ordinary. Groceries, the streaming services, Lily's school fees, the quarterly payment to the mortgage. But there, scattered across the 2-year period at irregular intervals, were payments to something called Vantage Consulting Group, payments that ranged from a few $100s to, in 2 cases, over $1,000. All of them listed simply as professional services. I cross-referenced the dates. 3 of the Vantage Consulting Group payments fell within the same weeks as 3 of the retreat entries. I sat with that for a long time. The following morning, Sunday, my phone rang at 9. It was Claire. "Hey," she said. Her voice was bright, rested, the voice of a woman who had spent the weekend in mountain air. "How's the house?" "Fine," I said. "Quiet. I had the most incredible restorative yoga session this morning. I feel like a completely different person." "That's good," I said. "You needed it." There was a pause, very brief, the length of a breath. "Is Lily back yet?" "Tomorrow morning. Mom's dropping her off." "Perfect. I'll be home by 4. I was thinking we could do that chicken you like." "Sure," I said. "That sounds good." When she hung up, I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the street outside and felt something settle in me that was not calm. It was colder than calm. It was the specific stillness of a decision made. That afternoon, while the house was still empty, I went through her home office. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Receipts, perhaps. Printed documents. Something physical and undeniable. Her desk was characteristically organized, color-coded folders in the filing drawer, labeled in her small, precise handwriting. I went through them methodically. Tax documents. Insurance. Old contracts from previous jobs. Nothing obvious. Then, behind the bottom drawer, pushed back against the rear wall where you'd only find it if you pulled the drawer all the way out, a second phone. It was a cheap prepaid model, the kind sold in gas stations. The battery was dead. I put it back exactly where I found it and closed the drawer and sat down in her desk chair and looked at the wall for a very long time. Marcus's choice not to confront Claire immediately is psychologically revealing and strategically significant. Rather than acting from the raw emotional impulse of shock and betrayal, he defaults to the analytical mode that defines his professional identity. He is an engineer. He assesses load bearing before striking walls. This is, on one level, a protective mechanism. By framing his response as a methodical investigation, he grants himself a buffer between the emotional reality and the necessity of facing it. But it is also a form of intelligence. Many betrayals are survived intact by the deceived partner precisely because premature confrontation allows the unfaithful partner to construct plausible cover before the evidence is complete. The discovery of the second phone is the pivot point of this section, and its impact is amplified by everything that preceded it. What had begun as a potentially explainable anomaly, a shared hotel room, could have a professional justification. The vantage payments might be legitimate consulting fees, has now crystallized into something with no innocent reading. A prepaid phone, hidden in a home office, is not careless. It is deliberate concealment. It indicates not just deception, but the sustained organizational effort of someone managing a parallel life. The coldness Marcus feels after Claire's Sunday morning call is not emotional detachment. It is the psyche's attempt to process a pain too large for immediate feeling. The chicken dinner she offers at the end of the call is almost unbearable in its mundane intimacy. A domestic gesture from a woman who does not know her husband has found the door to the room she thought was sealed. I bought a phone charger on Monday morning on my way to the office. Not the specific model. I didn't know what model the prepaid phone was, so I bought a universal charging kit, the kind sold near the register at electronics stores, with a collection of adapter heads in a plastic case. I paid cash. I thought about the fact that I was paying cash and understood that I had crossed some kind of threshold, that the version of myself who trusted without verification was already receding. I kept the charger in my car. The week Claire came home was a week I can only describe as double exposure, like two transparencies laid over each other, creating a single image that was almost coherent but faintly wrong in every detail. On the surface, our normal life. She made the chicken on Sunday. She asked about my work project, the commercial retrofit I'd been managing in the warehouse district. She sat with Lily at the kitchen table after dinner and helped her with a reading assignment, their heads bent together over the book, and the sight of that, the two of them, lamplight on their hair, hit me somewhere deep and complicated that I didn't have a name for yet. On Tuesday evening, she went to the gym. She was always back within 90 minutes. She was gone for 3 hours and 20 minutes. I didn't say anything when she came home. She said the class had run long. I said I hadn't noticed. She went upstairs to shower, and I sat in the living room and listened to the water run through the pipes in the walls. On Wednesday morning, I called Owen. Not to talk about football this time. Hypothetically, I said when he answered. I was in my car in the parking structure beneath my office building. Don't say hypothetically to a lawyer, he said. Just tell me what happened. I told him. The receipt, the dates, the financial transfers, the phone. There was a silence on his end that was different from his usual silences. The prepaid phone changes things, he said finally. That's not careless. That's infrastructure. I know. Do you want to know what you should do, or what you want to do? Both, I said. Document everything before you confront. Screenshot the bank records. Write down dates and times with notes. If you can get into the second phone without her knowing, do it, but don't break anything to get there, and don't do anything that could be characterized as illegal. And Marcus, he paused. Talk to someone. Not just me. I'm talking to you. I'm your friend. I'm also telling you that what you're describing has legal implications that you should understand before you act. I thanked him and sat in the parking structure for another 10 minutes before I could make myself go upstairs. The following Saturday, Claire was at a board meeting, or said she was. The meeting was listed in the shared calendar, confirmed by an entry she'd added 3 weeks prior. I drove to the offices of her organization and parked down the street. The building's lobby was visible from where I sat. I watched it for 40 minutes. I saw several people I recognized entering and leaving, board members whose faces I knew from organizational events I'd attended with Claire over the years. I did not see Claire. I drove home feeling something I hadn't expected, not confirmation of my worst fear, but a peculiar, unsettling possibility. Either she was inside the building and I'd missed her arrival, or she was somewhere else. I couldn't be certain which. That evening, I charged the prepaid phone in my car while she and Lily watched a film in the living room. I sat outside in the driveway for 45 minutes in the dark with the garage door cracked, the glow of the screen eventually brightening as the battery found its level. The phone had a 4-digit PIN. I tried her birthday, our anniversary, Lily's birthday, the 4th attempt, the year we'd met, opened it. The messages on the phone were from a contact saved only as D. There were hundreds of them, going back 22 months. I scrolled with a kind of terrible deliberateness, reading enough to understand, stopping when I needed to stop, continuing when I could. It was all there. The planning, the hotel arrangements, always made through him. The language of two people who had found in each other something they were unwilling to relinquish. There were arguments, 3 or 4, over the 2 years, about the future, about what this was, about whether it could become something visible and named. There were photographs. There were moments of ordinary tenderness that somehow cut deeper than anything else. I keep thinking about breakfast. The light in that room. I want that again. And her response, soon. I promise. Soon. I put the phone back on the charger. I went inside. I sat down on the couch beside my wife and daughter and watched the last 30 minutes of the film, and I did not speak unless spoken to, and I did not cry. I was not ready. Not yet. But I was close. The gathering of evidence phase reveals a man in a state of controlled psychological dissociation, the deliberate separation of emotional response from functional behavior. Marcus is not suppressing his feelings out of coldness. He is managing an overwhelming internal reality by channeling it into structured, purposeful action. This is a coping strategy that engineers, attorneys, and others trained in methodical problem-solving often default to in crisis. And it is simultaneously a strength and a vulnerability. The strength is that it prevents reckless confrontation before the picture is complete. The vulnerability is that the longer the emotional reckoning is deferred, the heavier it becomes. The detail of the parking surveillance, watching for Claire at her board meeting and finding himself unable to confirm either truth, is a masterful red herring the story builds and then deliberately leaves unresolved. Did she attend? Did she slip past? The ambiguity mirrors Marcus's experience of the entire investigation, certainty kept just out of reach. The prepaid phone, opened with the year they met, is a brutal irony. The most intimate possible password protecting the most devastating possible content. The final image, Marcus sitting beside Claire and Lily on the couch, watching a film, saying nothing, is one of the story's most psychologically precise moments. He is present in body and absent in every other way that matters, performing the surface of a life that is already ending, while the people beside him don't yet know that anything has changed. I waited until Lily was at school. This was not cruelty. Or perhaps it was, but it was also practicality. I needed the house empty, and I needed to be able to say whatever needed saying without monitoring myself through the presence of a child who was 9 years old and did not yet know that the world could contain this particular category of loss. It was a Thursday morning in early November. The light outside was the thin, pale gray of late autumn, the kind that makes everything look slightly overexposed. Claire had a work-from-home day. She was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, already at the table with her laptop open, a mug of tea beside her. She was wearing the cream-colored cardigan she'd had since before we were married. Her hair was up. She looked, as she often did in the mornings before the day made its demands, like herself in the most unguarded possible way. I put the hotel receipt on the table in front of her. She looked at it. Something happened in her face. Not a flinch, not a flush, but a very precise kind of stillness, the kind that precedes a controlled response. I had worked with enough people under pressure to recognize it. Marcus, I also found the phone, I said. The prepaid one. Behind the bottom drawer in your office. The stillness held for another 2 seconds. Then something in her posture changed, a slight drop in the shoulders, the particular physical grammar of a person deciding not to fight a position they know they cannot defend. How long have you known? She said. Since October, the weekend of the retreat. She closed her eyes. I thought I'd left that bag at home by accident. I came back for it, and she stopped. You came back for it, I said. The receipt was already in my hand. She opened her eyes and looked at me. She looked, I realized, like someone who had been waiting for this, not eagerly, but with the exhausted readiness of a person who has been carrying something unsustainable for too long. There was grief in her face. There was also, and this was the part that was most difficult to sit with, something that looked like relief. How long? I said. It was not quite a question. 2 years, she said. A little longer. Daniel Voss. Yes. The consultancy payments. Vantage. She nodded slowly. He set up the account. As a cover, for the hotels. I paid through the joint account, and she stopped again. I knew it was wrong. I knew it from the beginning. Did you? I said. It came out very flat. Marcus, I'm not going to sit here and ask you to understand something I don't fully understand myself. I know what I did. I know what it Her voice broke, very briefly, and then she recovered it. I know what it means. There was a silence that had the specific quality of a room being emptied, of everything familiar being suddenly reclassified as something else. Was it the retreats? I said. All of them. Most of them. She looked at her hands. The first two were real. The Mountain Clarity Center, I did go. And then the third one, I didn't. And after that, none of them. 8 retreats. 6 fabricated. 6 weekends I had watered the ficus and run errands and told Lily that her mother needed her rest. She worked so hard. She deserved this. Does he know about Lily? I said. He knows I have a daughter. She stopped. He's never met her. Does he want to? She was quiet for a moment that was longer than I expected. He asked, she said finally, about the future, about whether things would change. We've argued about it. And I told him I wasn't leaving my marriage. She looked up at me. That was true, Marcus. I want you to know that it was true, whatever it's worth now. It's worth something, I said. I wasn't sure if that was accurate. I don't know yet what it's worth. We sat across the kitchen table from each other for a long time, not speaking. The tea grew cold. Outside, a delivery truck moved slowly down the street. The house made its small sounds, the creak of the heating system, the particular knock the pipes gave when the water was running somewhere. Is it over? I said. With him. She looked at me with something that was not evasion, but was also not the clean, unambiguous answer I needed. I need it to be over, she said. I want it to be over. I know that's not. She stopped. I know that's not the same as saying yes. It was not the same as saying yes. I stood up from the table, and I picked up my keys and my jacket from the hook by the door, and I left the house. I sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes. Then I drove to Owen's office without calling first and sat in his waiting room until he had a gap between appointments. And then I went inside and I told him that I was done gathering evidence and that I needed to understand what came next. The confrontation scene is built around restraint, and it is that restraint that makes it devastating. Marcus does not shout. He does not accuse. He places evidence on a table and asks precise questions and waits. This is not emotional coldness. It is the behavior of a man who has had 4 weeks to feel what the confrontation itself would have triggered in most people in the immediate moment of discovery. His emotional reckoning happened in private, incrementally, over the course of the investigation. What he brings to this Thursday morning is not raw shock, but something much harder, informed grief. Claire's response is equally complex. The relief in her posture. The drop of the shoulders that Marcus reads with the precision of someone who knows her body language is psychologically authentic. Sustained deception is exhausting at a level that most people who have never done it fail to understand. The secret is not just the affair. It is the constant cognitive labor of maintaining parallel realities, managing 2 sets of emotional demands, ensuring that no detail slips out of alignment. When that collapses, there is, beneath the shame and the fear, a genuine release of pressure. The most devastating moment is her answer to whether it is over. I need it to be over. I want it to be over. This is a confession within a confession, an acknowledgement that the attachment has not been simply switched off by exposure, that the affair had its own emotional weight and momentum. It is honest. It is also, for Marcus, the one answer that makes reconciliation nearly impossible to imagine. The divorce was not immediate. These things never are, in the way that people who haven't been through them tend to imagine. There was a period of approximately 6 weeks during which Claire and I lived in the house together in a configuration that I can only describe as parallel habitation. 2 people sharing a physical space, sharing meals sometimes, sharing the logistics of a child's school schedule and medical appointments, and the small, bureaucratic details of a life that has been built together over 11 years and cannot simply be disassembled overnight. We were not hostile. We were not warm. We were 2 people moving through the same rooms with a new and mutual awareness that the rooms would not be shared indefinitely, and that the ending was no longer a question but only a matter of form. Lily knew something was wrong by the 2nd week. Children always know. She was 9, not young enough to be shielded by incomprehension and not old enough to be told the full truth. She began sleeping with her door cracked instead of closed. She started appearing in the kitchen in the mornings before either of us, sitting at the table with her cereal already poured, watching the door as each of us entered separately. She became quieter at dinner. Once, folding laundry in the hallway, I heard her in her room, talking to her class hamster in a low, earnest voice. It's okay. Sometimes things change, and it's still okay. I did not tell my mother for 3 weeks. When I did, she came to the house and sat with me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd placed the receipt, where Claire and I had sat across from each other in November, and she didn't say much. She made tea. She put her hand over mine. She said, "You'll know what Lily needs. You've always known what she needs." I don't know why that was the thing that made me cry, finally and completely, for the first time since October. But it was. Claire moved out in early December. She took what was hers and left what was mine, and we divided the middle ground with the careful, slightly formal negotiation of people who had once known each other well enough not to need to negotiate anything. She rented an apartment across the city, near her office, she said. I did not ask about proximity to anything else. Daniel Voss, as far as I could establish, was not part of her new daily life in any visible way. She had, by December, told me that it was over with him, told me directly, without ambiguity this time. I believed her. I wasn't sure that it mattered, in terms of my own path forward, but I believed her. The legal process took the better part of a year. Owen was not my attorney. He couldn't be, ethics and friendship being what they are, but he helped me find someone good, and he was available by phone in the evenings when the paperwork got to be too much and I needed to talk through something that felt simultaneously urgent and unbearable. The divorce was uncontested on the major issues. Claire did not fight for more than was fair. I did not punish her through the settlement for things that could not be addressed through settlement. We were, in the mechanics of separation, as decent to each other as we had once been in the mechanics of a shared life. Lily spent 3 days with me and 4 with Claire in the first arrangement. Then we adjusted as we learned what actually worked rather than what we projected would work. She cried the first night in each new configuration, and then, with the stunning adaptability of children, she found her footing. By spring, she was moving between us with the specific competence of a child who has figured out the terrain. She still asked, sometimes, questions I didn't know how to answer. Why did this happen? Was one of them. I told her that sometimes adults make choices that are wrong, and that those choices have consequences, and that none of it had anything to do with her or with how much either of us loved her. She nodded with the solemn, evaluating attention she gave to things she was deciding whether to believe. I spent a long time, after the divorce was finalized, trying to understand the architecture of what had happened. Not to assign blame in a ledger. That impulse faded faster than I expected, but to understand what had been real and what had been performance, and where, if anywhere, the line between them ran. Here is what I concluded, incompletely and without certainty. The marriage had been real. The love had been real, or real enough that the distinction stopped matching. What had also been real, and what I had perhaps not allowed myself to see with sufficient clarity, was the slow accumulation of distance that had begun well before the retreats, before Daniel Voss, before the prepaid phone behind the bottom drawer. A marriage requires more than decency and routine. It requires a certain kind of deliberate attention, not just to the logistics of a shared life, but to the interior landscape of the person you've chosen to live it with. We had both, I think, grown comfortable with the surface of each other. We had stopped asking the questions that required courage to answer. This is not, I want to be clear, an absolution of what she did. What she did was a choice, made repeatedly, over 2 years, maintained through sustained and deliberate deception that involved our finances, our calendar, our daughter's weekends. The betrayal was real and its consequences were real, and I did not arrive at any version of understanding that collapsed those facts into something smaller than they were. But I also did not want to spend the rest of my life carrying only the story of what was done to me. That version of events was true, but it was not the only true version, and living inside it exclusively seemed like a different kind of trap. I began running longer distances. I rebuilt the backyard project that had stalled in August and finished it in March, working on weekends when Lily was with Claire, filling the time with the specific satisfaction of physical work that ends in something visible and stable. I learned, slowly, to be alone without the particular ache that had characterized the first months. I began, cautiously and without urgency, to think about what I wanted the next part of my life to look like. My daughter, who is now 10 and a half and has an opinion about everything, told me recently that our house smells different since her mother left. I asked her how. She thought about it with her characteristic gravity and said, like wood and coffee, instead of that other stuff. I asked her if that was okay. She said yes. She thought it was fine. She was just noticing. I told her that noticing was good. That noticing was, in fact, one of the most important things. I meant it about her. I also meant it about myself. Because this is what I know now, after a year of learning it the hardest possible way. The moments that matter most are rarely the dramatic ones. They are not the receipts found on bathroom floors or the prepaid phones charged in dark driveways. They are the small, daily choices to be present, to ask the real question instead of the easy one, to resist the comfort of assumption, to keep choosing the person in front of you with the same intention you brought to the beginning. I didn't do that perfectly. Neither did she. And so, we arrived where we arrived. The ficus, for what it's worth, is still alive. I water it every Sunday without being reminded. The resolution of this story resists the twin temptations of melodrama and false peace. Marcus neither collapses into victimhood nor arrives at an unconvincing wholeness. What he reaches is something more honest and more durable, a partial understanding, held with appropriate uncertainty, that allows forward movement without requiring the erasure of pain. The detail of Lily noticing that the house now smells different, like wood and coffee, instead of that other stuff, is one of the story's finest moments. Children encode emotional reality and sensory experience before they have the language for it. Her observation is both innocent and devastating. She is describing, without knowing it, the absence of her mother's presence as a physical fact, the way a room changes when someone who filled it stops doing so. Marcus's response, noticing is good, doubles as a personal manifesto. It is the lesson the story has been building toward, not the discovery of betrayal, but the recovery of attention. His final reflection on the small daily choices, asking the real question, resisting assumption, continuing to choose deliberately, is not a verdict on Claire's culpability, but a reorientation of his own future. The ficus, watered every Sunday without being reminded, is the story's closing image and its most quietly powerful one. It was her instruction, spoken the morning she left for a hotel in Cartwell. He has kept it, not for her, but because he is now, consciously and deliberately, the kind of man who keeps his word to himself. This story is, at its deepest level, about the gap between attention and assumption, and the specific tragedy of a man who was present in every logistical sense of the word while being quietly absent in the ones that ultimately matter most. Marcus Hale is not a bad husband by conventional measure. He is considerate, stable, loving in the quiet, habitual way that long marriages tend to produce. But the story traces a subtle and devastating truth, that stability, without continued curiosity, can calcify into invisibility. He stopped truly seeing Claire, not out of malice, but out of the comfort of certainty. He assumed he knew her because he once had. She, in turn, found in Daniel Voss something that the marriage had gradually stopped providing. Not necessarily passion, but the specific experience of being genuinely noticed, questioned, pursued. This is not a justification. Her choices were wrong, sustained, and damaging in ways that rippled far beyond the two of them, most painfully into the life of a 9-year-old girl who could only articulate the loss as a change in how the house smelled. But the story insists on complexity, which is the only intellectually honest position available. Betrayal is almost never a single event. It is the final, visible manifestation of a process that has been building, invisibly, for much longer. The receipt was the moment of discovery. The distance that created the conditions for it had been growing for years before that. What Marcus ultimately learns, and what the story offers to anyone who has experienced something similar, is that the opposite of betrayal is not vigilance. It is not surveillance or suspicion or the defensive posture of someone who can never again afford to trust. The opposite of betrayal is the ongoing, effortful, sometimes uncomfortable practice of genuine presence, of asking the real question, of watering the ficus not because you were told to, but because you chose to.